Hello and welcome to Faith, Friends, and Hustle, a podcast where my friends and I share stories, insights, and practical tips on their faith, relationships, and mission. Today, I'm excited to introduce my guest, Mike, a disciple of Jesus, family man, historian, footballer, and author. Mike's lived a fascinating life, and I've had an opportunity to actually coach youth soccer with him and get to know him a little bit. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Mike, what should we know about you? Fill us in.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. So just to kind of piggyback off what you just said, I'm happy to be here and to be considered a friend and to be able to share a little bit about myself and what I do. And although I wouldn't consider my hustle a hustle in the sense of what I think most people think of it as, where I'm raking in all this money, it is something that's creative and it's a good outlet for me. But I'll get to that, I'm sure, in a second. But about myself, I've lived in Ohio my whole life, and I've only been in our area here in Mansfield for 11 years, going on 11 years, yeah. And as you allude to, my son Everett, he plays soccer, and so that's how I've gotten to know you, which is a great thing in and of itself. But just to be able to continue pursuing soccer from my younger years through college up until now as an adult, that's been a blessing as well. Soccer plays a big part in my life. All my close friends from high school, we all played on the team together. We all buddied around, that sort of thing. So that's kind of how my formative years were shaped, I guess you could say. I went to college. I got an undergrad bachelor's degree in history. And then I also was teaching for a while. I taught online for about 8.5, 9 years, including everything that I did with subbing and all that. And then I pivoted into higher ed right as COVID was hitting, and everybody was, not really knowing what was going to happen. Everything in education was shifting online. And so through my alma mater, my undergrad alma mater, I asked the history department, I was like, hey, do you have any need for, assisting you to get online or the courses I need taught? I just had finished my master's at that point. And they said, yes, please. And so I got to kind of jump, feet first into higher education as an instructor, doing online courses. And that then kind of opened the door for me to get into higher ed full-time, leave teaching behind and become an instructional designer. And basically what that is, I design and build undergrad, graduate, and post-grad courses for a university in North Dakota, University of Jamestown. And I just finished my first year in that position. So it's been a whirlwind, but it's been a good one. So that's kind of where I come.
Right?
Yeah. I guess I forgot about that part. So while I was subbing back in 2013 at my high school, actually, the first kind of long-term gig I got was an in-school suspension position. The teacher who did that I think he had a surgery or something. And so they were like, yeah, we need you for, I think it started out as 6 weeks, but it turned out to be pretty much into the bulk of that school year. And so it was a room essentially where I had anywhere from 1 to, 6 kids who were, serving their in-school suspension. So it was very quiet. I never had to break up any fights or anything. So it wasn't like that. But it was a good spot for me to kind of bring my writing materials with me from home into that and work on it while I did that subbing job. That was 2013 into 14. That's when I published my first book. It was a World War II historical fiction book. And then 3 more came after that in the next 3 years. So that was my first foray into writing. And then after that, I had already moved by that point. I was married. I started to have kids. And I was working on the next book that just was the one that just came out. And that was a 7-year project. So right around 2017 is when I started that one. And then it just published in the end of 24. And so through all of that, I was writing here and there when I had time. Some chunks of time were longer and more intense. Other times I didn't write for weeks. So it's just kind of whenever I could, make the time to do it. But again, it's a good outlet, creatively and mentally, I think too. It's good to have something, even if you're, working on something, it's good to have something else that kind of adds that diversity to your cognition, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know that there is a sense of hustle and a definition people have, but the hurriness and hustle, I like the characteristics and the way it describes it, right? Because so many of my friends and people just like you, when you hear their story and their walk of faith and what it looks like and in their lives and the ambitions they have, these are some ambitious people. And hopefully that's coming across even as you talk there, right? Not only are you recommending that, hey, let me teach this course and taking a step, or let me create this position for me to make a living and to be able to share my expertise in it, all while writing a book, leading a family. That's a lot. That's a hustle all in itself of when it comes through it.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. When I hear hustle, I think of, for whatever reason, I think of a single young adult person working in a suit, in some law firm or something, and they're doing their thing, and maybe not a law firm, but that sort of idea where it's somebody who has the energy and the time and minimal obligations and responsibilities that they just churn it out and do the grind, and that's that. But yeah, hustle does have a plethora of meanings. It just depends on the context, I guess.
Yeah. So what's interesting is athletic guy speaking passionately, still follow football all the way through, but you go into history and you have a deep sense of interest and passion around history too. So what initially sparked that? Like, how do we go from athletic, I'm in it, to I love history and exploring the past?
Yeah. Well, I initially, when I got into high school, as I got into junior and senior years, especially, I wanted to get into graphic design, like video game graphics, movie effects, because at the time, from junior high into high school, that's when the Star Wars prequels and then Lord of the Rings were all coming out. Those were all in the same, 6 years or whatever it was. And there, I was very impressionable at the time, and I think I owe it to my dad to a degree, where we would watch the special bonus features on the DVDs of the movies. And so seeing how the things are made, seeing the process and kind of the behind the scenes bit, that really interested me. And I was like, I want to do that. So when I got to college, I declared that I was going to be a computer science major. And as time would go on, I would then plan to specialize in whatever I would need to do that sort of thing. But the first class, freshman fall semester, it was a JavaScript class, and I hated it. And I was like, I can't do this for forever. I would lose my mind. And so, speaking with my advisor, long story short, she said, what's something that you enjoy or that you're, good at, quote unquote. And I said, well, I was, I was good at history in high school. I enjoyed it. I think it's interesting to see the past. And by that time, without naming films, I've seen a number of films and read a few books, about history, and I appreciated it. And so she said, well, how about this? You can switch to history just so we can get you on the book somewhere. Because from a higher ed perspective, if you're in there and you're undeclared and you're going through time without any real direction in terms of what you're trying to obtain degree wise, it eats up your money, not to mention your time. So she said, let's get you in the books for a history major. And then I would also encourage you get into education. The way that it worked was that was a freshman fall semester. The first education track course started in the spring. And she was like, you can enroll in the spring, you're not too late for that. You can take the course. If you like it, great. You're on, you started the track on time. If not, then you can just chalk it up to experience and do something else with history. And so long story short, I got into that and did education. So that's how I got into history. It's just kind of not quite a whim, but it was kind of just like a happenstance, finding myself at a crossroads sort of thing. And then the rest is history.
Yeah. Yeah, providence of God, right? Reigning and I think fulfilling, and you see the fruits of that when you get in and you're in your works and your passions and what you're doing. Things tend to work out as they should.
Yeah, and it's weird looking back because I don't think that I would have seen everything that I do now with history, not even just my degree, credentials wise, but just what I've read and studied and researched and written about. I don't think I could have seen that back when I was a spry 19 going on 20-year-old. I was old for my class, and so I turned 20 my freshman year of college.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm thankful for what God did for that, in that rather for me.
Yeah. So where are we in your walk in faith at that time? Biblically, were you in it? Are we discipling? Are we just aware?
Well, I grew up a preacher's kid, so take that for what you will. We always joke about that in my circle of friends. But anyway, yeah, my dad was the preacher at our church, and my mom did various things. She played the piano, she led worship team, adult choir, she did secretarial work for a while. She kind of bounced around, but we were very much like, I grew up thinking that we owned the church, that my dad, that was our building.
Yeah.
Obviously that I realized that eventually, but so between that and just kind of our home life, obviously my dad and mom were very good at living out their faith and modeling that for us. I have 3 older sisters, and then me. And so between the 4 of us, there's quite an age gap. So we weren't all in the house at the same time for a long time. But that's kind of how we grew up, with them as our role models, knowing that, church was just going to be part of our weekly routine. I don't want to say routine because that makes it seem like it's just running through the emotions and that sort of thing. But at the time of college, I was very much and still am a firm believer in God and in Christ and everything that kind of is represented and kind of packed into his story, the 33 years that he lived on this earth. And so that time for me, in terms of, I'm thinking of one of your questions that you have about how does faith and my life intersect. I wasn't deep in it in the sense of I felt comfortable discipling to others and talking, like with a lot of my friends, like they knew my dad and they knew that I was in a religious family, and that I had faith, but it wasn't anything that we talked about a lot, I guess. And I don't necessarily think we should have or regret that we didn't or anything, but that's, I was kind of in a position where, or a place, I guess, where I felt comfortable knowing where my faith was, and I grew it little by little as time went on. So in college, I lived 40 minutes. I lived on campus, and the school I went to was 40 minutes from home. And so it was close enough to where if I wanted to zip home for a weekend, I could. But if I wasn't home, then I was still close enough to where mom or dad could come see me, or I was far enough away to where it was like just enough to where it wasn't quite convenient. So take that for what you may. But so it was nice to have that opportunity to still, be able to come home and go to church with what, where I grew up going to church and hear my dad preach and all that. So so that point was very much still formative, but it was very familiar and very part of who I was, even though I wasn't the same person as I had been growing up, like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, growing through it. So, and it just helps with the scope, I think, of the influence of what it has, because as you move through and progress through your life and we come out, you decide to write. So where did that, like, how does the biblical influence between history and going into writing, where does that connection, and what made you feel like, man, I'm ready to write some books?
I'm not really sure. And I can't even, as I think back on it, I can't even really pinpoint when the thought came to me of, I want to write a book or I want to write stories. I mean, I was one of those kids that had, if you remember those old, they were in various sizes, but it was a pads paper, but it was that kind of old school paper with the 2 solid lines and the dotted line in the middle, and there was space above it to where you could draw something and then write about it or whatever. And so I would have oodles and oodles of pads like that. And I was big into dinosaurs. And so I would, as a little kid, I would draw and write about dinosaurs. And so I think the idea of telling stories, it was there from very early on, but it didn't really crystallize into what it's become until later. I don't know if I was ever conscious, like I said, of pinpointing a time where I consciously said I want to write a book. It just kind of materialized into what it became. I think around the time that I started writing, I don't know if there was any one particular influence, but I remember hearing about self-publishing and having the limited knowledge, understanding of that I did at the time of the big publishers, Penguin, Random House, all those bigger names that you see on the books. I came to realize that self-publishing was more or less just a way that you could just get out the word that you want without having to go through those, what we call in the industry, gatekeepers. And so the big publishers, they have a much narrower eye of the needle that authors' works go through, that they scrutinize it, they gauge it, how much money can we make off of this, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot less of that and even none of that in self-publishing, just because you are calling the shots of how you want your work to get out there. And so I think that kind of just the inherent nature of that kind of pulled me from wherever I was with storytelling into that direction to where, I could do this. And then coupled with that, in junior year of college, I was in an intro to fiction class. It was just a gen ed requirement. And I chose that class. And long story short, I wrote a story that was entered into a contest. And I just thought it was just, it was going to get published in the magazine on campus if you placed, top 3 or whatever. And then that was that. But my professor said, hey, you got second place in your category. You can expect a check within the week. And I was like, a check? And he explained it. And I was like, oh, okay. So I got $100 for writing a short story.
That's exciting.
That I had no intention of, I had no realization that I'd be making money off of it. And so I guess that was, if anything, that I guess that could be seen as the motivating factor, is to, I could write and make money. If I can do this, I can do it more, do more of that on a larger scale.
Yeah. And you had mentioned creativity and enjoying and that, that's certainly a motivator when you realize suddenly I could get paid for my creativity or going down a path.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So then that comes to your newest book, and run through the title, because I don't want to mess up the last word.
It's funny that you say that, because my one sister and I were talking about it the other day, and she mispronounced the last word too. So, and I don't know if it's just because I don't want to say that I'm well read. That sounds pretentious, but I'm pretty good with words. I'm the one in our nuclear family that I spell things for people if they don't know how it's spelled. So anyway, the Ivory Obelisk, and I have a copy on hand here, so I'll hold it up. So
yeah,
obelisk.
Okay,
I've never
heard
it say. Right. Sure. Yeah. I've never heard it pronounced as obelisk, but maybe it is, and I'm wrong. But I've always heard it as obelisk. But anyway, so the basic premise of this story. Well, I guess the reason why it came about in the first place, before I get to it, is that I wanted to kind of explore the psychological side of a character. In my first 4 books, it was more kind of plot driven, somewhat character driven, but
you pulled a lot from your history background though too in those books, right? Like from what I can gather,
in those books, those books were all 4 of those were World War II based, and so very much steeped in factual accounts. This is what happened, but the specific details are changed and or made up, and so that's where a lot of historical fiction, wherever you look, it's always couched in some sort of real place, real time.
Dip their toes in truth, but
a
lot of detail.
But the details, the minutiae of that story is where it changes. And so I had done those, and they were very much kind of looking at the action of the story that they were, or just the motivating action of the story, I guess you could say. And so with this one, I wanted to look more at kind of the psychology of a character. In my notes on the screen here above me, I had the working title for the longest time was Mental Mansion. I knew that I wanted to have it take place in a mansion or some sort of manor. And I knew that it was going to be some sort of mental something. Part of the influence, and this is kind of how I contextualize it for people now, I say if you cross the movies Clue, so from 1985 with Tim Curry, that was one that we grew up with. That was a classic. So the kind of the whodunit of Clue with Inception, so Christopher Nolan's 2010 film Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio, and then what's the third one? There's a movie that came out, I forget when, I want to say 2003, called Identity, and it's with John Cusack and a number of other well-knowns. So if you mix those together, that's kind of the basic, not plot-wise, but the basic structural gist of this book. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of layers, and it's all kind of wrapped up in a murder, not murder mystery, I don't want to call it that, but things happen along those lines. And so part of that is what then sets the stage for how the character kind of digs into himself, his past, his memory, his mind, kind of how he perceives things, and what the implications come about from that when you have guilt and regret. That's kind of without giving too much away, that guilt and regret are the main kind of emotive underlying factors, I guess, for this character. So yeah, so it was very different from the other books, but still has a little bit of historical fiction in it. To kind of
it's over a 7-year span. You wrote this book, right? You said
right, but the current form that it has was really only the last 2.5-ish years.
Got it. So it's kind of an idea 7 years ago, but then you really started working on it like 2. Okay.
Yeah, I fleshed out quite a bit of stuff early on, but bits and pieces didn't work. So I kept this, threw that out, kept that. And then over those first 4 years or so, 3 or 4 years, that's kind of what came through. So it's almost like sifting rocks through a screen in a river. Only a few things made it out that were big enough to be like, okay, this is good enough to keep, and I'll use it somehow. And then around that, those ideas is what then became the final product.
Got it. What was the most challenging thing about writing this book and looking at the character as opposed to the environment or theme, I guess we could describe it, but now we're talking about something like the spirit in the human conscious?
Yeah, I didn't want to, and that's part of what the last 2.5-ish years brought about, is kind of the writing took on an organic feel to where I almost let the story it was almost writing itself in a way. I know authors say that a lot and it sounds cliche, but it's this idea that you don't plan every step out. And so as you're writing things, something might come to mind that is really cool and that you might want to explore. And so you then kind of logically go, okay, well, if that happens, what's the next thing? And letting that kind of work itself out versus, okay, I'm going to have character A do this, and then he's going to do that. That's very mundane and very basic, and doesn't make for good writing. And so that's kind of how the writing happened organically. And so part of that was trying to fight the story getting into the supernatural, because the intent wasn't to make it some sort of story where it was bringing in questions about supernatural things, because that's a whole genre unto itself, and I didn't want it to be that. But also I wasn't trying to write it to specifically or purposefully address supernatural or issues of what you have faith in, or things you can't see or understand, stuff like that. So it was kind of a challenge to kind of tame that, while still maintaining my understanding. I have my faith, I know what it is, but this is fiction, so it's just fake, So that was kind of the fun yet challenging to a degree sort of aspect of that.
That's awesome. So what advice would you give someone who's looking in, maybe aspiring writers or thinking about maybe self-publishing is the route they want to go?
I mean, one of the notes I made for myself here, I am someone who really likes to plan things. And so it kind of runs counter to what I just said. I like to be organized. I have plans. I have all these things that I like to kind of do because I'm a big picture kind of process person. So if I can understand and if I can carry out things to how I understand it, then it makes it easier and it's more enjoyable. And so with writing, again, you can plan out a plot in a story, but you can only do so much. And so part of the other side of that coin is, a lot of authors say, just keep writing, just, write till you're actively writing, doing something. I think that's good, but it's for me, it's not good to just write aimlessly. And so that's the tension between planning and just doing things organically. So what I would say for anybody who wants to write, if you want to just keep writing, maybe journaling every day would be good. That way you're writing, you're in the rhythm of putting words onto the page or to the keyboard.
Maybe like flexing that muscle. I've heard it.
Yeah. But you're not necessarily potentially wasting time just aimlessly writing about characters that don't have any real connection to each other plot-wise or things like that. So that's kind of one thing I would say. If you're really serious about wanting to get into writing and whether it's self-published or not, just writing stories, there's a really good series of books by an author. And I have it linked. I can email it to you if you include it in the notes or whatnot. But it's by an author named K.M. Weiland. And it's helping writers become authors. That's the name of the series. Currently, there are 11 books on Amazon. Some of them are workbooks that are companions to other books in the series. But she does a fantastic job of laying out, how do you go about structuring a story? How do you go about writing characters? What role does theme play in a story? And she also has her own podcasts and different things like that too, that kind of supplement all that. And so that's really kind of what I wish that I would have had when I started. Now, some of the books were only just published in the last few years, so obviously that wouldn't have been possible. But I know what I have here too is while anyone can write a story that may mimic ones that we already know. So obviously, we as a civilization, we are storytellers by nature, and a lot of stories are just recycled stories from the past. So there's where history comes back into play again.
Yeah, there's a finite amount of emotion.
Right. Yeah.
Right? The emotions there's intricate, there's details, they could be complex, and yet the overall arching thing is there's only so many defined emotions.
Yes. Yeah. And so, over the centuries of our human existence, we have told stories over and over again. And while everyone might not be exactly the same, they all play on those same themes and things. And so while you might be able to write stories that mimic ones you already know. So for example, if I wanted to write a book, which originally the next project I'm working on started out as a story in the same kind of vein as Lord of the Rings, because again, when I started writing, that's what was fresh on my mind. While you can write things that mimic what you see and know, it's not going to be done well if you just go at it just because you like the genre or because you like the movie or the story or whatever. So the act of crafting a story from scratch that accounts for all of the different moving parts that make a great story, that is the main challenge to overcome as an aspiring writer. And so you have to first understand those moving parts and how things work, because there is a system. Reading her books more and other ones that I picked up along the way, there is a system to writing. Everybody writes different, just as we all learn differently too. But there, for plots to work, certain things have to be in place. How you go about doing it might vary, but certain points need to be in specific spots for it to work. And so that's what those books have really shown me. And that's kind of what I'm excited about with my next project, is that in the tail end of Obelisk, I was applying things as I was going back through and writing and rewriting some things with that. So it's cool to kind of be able to apply those. But knowing that I didn't have all that information at the start of that project was kind of like, I'll have to get it next time. So moving forward, I have a better understanding and better feel, and I feel more comfortable with the craft of writing. And but like with anything, it's not, rarely is it ever going to be finished. You know, there's very rarely any finality with something like writing. Same thing with learning. You know, you're never ever going to learn and know and understand everything there is to know. So there's always room for improvement, always room for things like that. So that's what's exciting to me. So for aspiring authors or anybody who wants to write and self-publish, that would be what I would say. Look into those books. Self-publishing aspect, though, she doesn't really cover that per se. That's more of a separate topic. She's looking more at the craft of writing. But there are a lot of good resources out there too on how to self-publish and what to do.
Which can help you make it faster, right? It just gets you to what you need to know by people who's done it before and have an idea, which speeds up the process. Again, what we're talking about, and I loved what you said, is mastery is very much a direction, not a destination.
Yes.
Right. We will only be mastered once we pass from this life into eternity with Jesus. Then everything will be great. But on this side of it, we can only head that direction, but we'll never arrive. There's no end to our learning and what we're capable of doing.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to think about in that context, and that's part of the fun too, I think, is you know, using our gifts that we've been given to do these sorts of things. And it's one of the things that I struggled with for a while was, you know, the idea that, you know, using God's gifts that he's given us to bring glory to his name. And it's like, well, how can I use a story about a guy who's dealing with guilt and regret to bring glory to God without explicitly writing God into the plot or into the story? And so that's been something that I've grappled with, but I think of it more as if I'm exercising my gifts, even if it's not explicitly praising God, like we think of, you know, singing praise songs. It's looking into ourselves and in my case, creativity, to where I'm not just sitting idly by, not using my creativity. So I think the idea of just using our gifts brings God glory. And so that's something that I've kind of noodled on for a while. And I didn't think I'd talk about it right now, but yeah, there you go. I
love that. That's a whole conversation in itself. So I think we will end there, because that's a lot to meditate, and to think about. So I follow you on Amazon, but I would like to know, where can we buy your books? Where can people get your books? I'll put it in the show notes too, but is there something outside of Amazon or?
Yeah, well, I guess I should have started off by saying that I write under a pen name. And so my pen name is Eli Kale. And it's funny because there was a movie growing up, and I'm blanking on it now, a movie growing up that there was a character in it named Kale. And for some reason, I liked that name growing up. And so I carried that in when I was thinking of pen names, because at the time when I was starting to write, I had the idea that I would probably be working toward a master's degree and eventually a PhD in history. So I would want to keep my actual name reserved for scholarly writing that I do. So I want to keep my fiction under a different name. And so I was thinking back, and I was like, oh, I'll use Kale. And I think the character, in hindsight now I know this, the character's name of Kale was spelled C-A-L-E. Mine is K-A-L-E. But I didn't realize it at the time when I chose that name, that kale is a vegetable. We did not have kale growing up in our house, and I did not know it was a thing until after I was writing, ironically enough. And then also ironically, I was working at Kroger when I first got married and moved to Mansfield. I didn't get any teaching jobs offered to me, and so I had to work somewhere. And so I worked in the produce department with kale every day. And so people thought, oh, you picked kale because you are in produce. And I was like, no, I did not. So that's kind of the running joke in my family and whatnot.
That is funny. Yeah. Well, the story is too.
Yeah.
I told my wife when I first met you, because our boys play on the same soccer team, and it came across, and I'm like, wait a minute, who am I coaching with? This guy's got two different names. Took me a second, and then I figured out what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I chose that, and I do have a website. I can give you that, and then
Yep.
I'm on social media. I do have Facebook and then Twitter. I do have an Instagram, but I'm not on that as much.
Yeah. And you have a blog too, right? But all that can probably be found
that's
through
on the
your
website. Yeah. Yeah. Everything actually is on the website now that I think of it. All the social media and everything. On Amazon, you can follow me as an author. And that was something I didn't realize until a few years ago, that you can follow authors. I just think of Amazon as I can go on there and purchase a book or whatever, and then I move on. But yeah, so my author page on there has my bio and stuff, but all the books that I have to my name are all in one place. So I can give you all those links and everything. But yeah, so that's how that works out.
That's awesome. Well, I am sure, and I know a lot of my friends in circles love fictional books. I'll recommend it. We'll get it out there, and then yeah, we'll put everything in the notes. Love talking with you today. Thank you for sharing your story, your passions, and walking through that. And I look forward to see what the next project is you come out with.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. The project I'm working on now, it's very early on, so I'm not going to give any details out now. But it's a different take from what I've done in the past. That's something that with my writing I wanted to do too, is I don't want to just write the same type of stuff all the time. So this is going to be a little bit different as well. So once I know more and have a better feel for how it's going to pan out, I'll get that out to the public. But yeah, any passing along of my stuff, my books, anybody who reads it, if you can give it a thumbs up, I almost said, if you can give it a star rating on Amazon, a review, even if you feel so inclined, that'd be great. I appreciate it. Because that's, as a self-published person, that's my marketing. I don't really do marketing. It's just more just kind of an organic thing. Pass it along between family and friends. It just kind of goes out as it does from there. So the more reviews and ratings I can get, and word of mouth and that sort of thing, that's how I can get my stuff out there. So I really appreciate it. But yeah, thanks for having me on today, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here in the spring when we get our boys team ready, up and running for the spring season.
Yeah, we're in that mindset already, aren't we?
Yep, looking forward to it.
Awesome. All right, thank everyone so much for joining me. Till the next time. See you.